At precisely 11:47 a.m. on March 18, 1945, the sky above Berlin began to darken, with something far more ominous than storm clouds. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, manning his 80mm flak gun on the roof of the Reich Chancellery, felt his blood turn to ice as he raised his binoculars and witnessed what no German had ever seen before. Wave after wave of Allied bombers stretching from horizon to horizon, their silver forms glinting in the pale spring sunlight like a plague of metal locusts descending upon the dying Reich. "Mein Gott," Müller whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing thunder of 1,000 engines. "There are so many. How can there be so many?" The 22-year-old gunner from Bavaria, who had survived 3 years of air raids and witnessed the gradual decline of the Luftwaffe, had never seen anything approaching this scale of aerial assault. His hands trembled as he tried to count the formations: American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators in tight combat boxes, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs that danced around the bomber streams like deadly guardian angels. Below in the streets of Berlin, Frau Greta Hoffmann was hanging laundry in the courtyard of her apartment building when the air raid sirens began their familiar wail. At 43, the mother of two had lived through hundreds of bombing alerts, but something about the intensity of the approaching engine noise made her drop her washing and look up with growing dread. What she saw in the sky above her beloved city would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. "The entire sky was black with planes," she would write in her diary that evening, if she lived to see evening. Not just a few squadrons like before, but an ocean of bombers that seemed to stretch forever. I knew in that moment that this was the end, not just of the war but of everything we had known. The psychological impact of witnessing such overwhelming aerial superiority was immediate and devastating. Throughout Berlin, civilians and soldiers alike stood transfixed by the awesome display of Allied power, their minds struggling to comprehend the scale of what they were witnessing. The Nazi propaganda that had sustained German morale through years of increasingly desperate fighting seemed suddenly ridiculous in the face of such undeniable evidence of enemy strength. In the basement of the Adlon Hotel, which had been converted into an air raid shelter, 80-year-old Professor Wilhelm Schmidt pressed his face against a small window and watched the bombers approach with the fascination of a scientist observing a rare phenomenon. The retired historian, who had lived through both world wars, recognized that he was witnessing a pivotal moment in human history. "This is how empires end," he murmured to the huddled civilians around him. Not with a whimper, but with the thunder of 1,000 engines announcing the dawn of a new age. "We are watching the funeral procession of the Third Reich." The formation that was approaching Berlin represented the largest daylight bombing raid ever mounted against the German capital, comprising 1,321 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force, escorted by 632 fighter aircraft. The mission, designated Operation Clarion, was designed not merely to destroy military targets, but to deliver a psychological blow that would shatter German morale and hasten the Reich's surrender. Major General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force from his headquarters in England, had conceived the massive raid as the aerial equivalent of Sherman's March to the Sea, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that resistance would become psychologically impossible. The 1,000 bombers approaching Berlin carried more than explosives. They bore the weight of Allied determination to end the war through sheer, irresistible force. High above the city, in his Messerschmitt Bf 109, Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, one of Germany's few remaining ace pilots, felt his heart sink as he counted the endless streams of enemy aircraft. With only 12 operational fighters available to intercept the massive formation, he knew that his squadron faced not a battle, but a massacre. Yet duty demanded that he try. "All flights, this is Eagle Leader," he transmitted to his remaining pilots, his voice steady despite the hopelessness of their situation. "We are outnumbered 100 to 1, but we are still German pilots. We will do our duty even if it costs us everything." The radio crackled with acknowledgements from pilots who knew they were flying their last mission. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been reduced to this: a handful of brave men in obsolete aircraft facing an armada that darkened the sky. Their sacrifice would be noted in history, but it would not change the outcome of the day. On the ground, Berlin's air defenses prepared for the onslaught with grim determination. The city's flak towers, massive concrete fortresses bristling with anti-aircraft guns, swiveled their barrels skyward, while their crews loaded shells with mechanical precision born of desperate practice. Yet even the veteran gunners felt a chill of fear as they contemplated engaging such an enormous formation. Oberst Friedrich Weber, commanding the Flak Regiment Berlin, stood atop the zoo bunker and surveyed the approaching armada through his field glasses. In 30 years of military service, he had never seen anything comparable to the aerial fleet bearing down on his city. His professional assessment was stark and unforgiving. "Gentlemen," he announced to his staff officers, "we are about to witness the end of strategic bombing as we have known it. This is not a raid, it is an execution. We will fight, but we must prepare our people for devastation unlike anything Berlin has experienced." The civilians of Berlin, those who had survived years of bombing, rationing, and hardship, emerged from their shelters and buildings to stare in amazement at the sky. Despite the danger, many found themselves unable to look away from the awesome spectacle of aerial power unfolding above their heads. Children pointed in wonder, while their parents struggled to comprehend the implications of what they were seeing. 12-year-old Klaus Weber, son of a Wehrmacht officer killed on the Eastern Front, stood on his apartment building's roof with several other children, watching the approaching bombers with the fascination that only the young can maintain in the face of mortal danger. His diary entry that night would capture the moment with startling clarity. "Today I saw something that seemed impossible. The entire sky filled with enemy planes. They came like thunder, like the end of the world. I was not scared, only amazed. How could any country build so many planes? How could they have so many pilots? We were told that America was weak, but weak countries do not fill the sky with bombers." The formation's approach had been monitored by German radar stations for over an hour, but the scale of what was coming had seemed so impossible that many operators had initially dismissed their readings as equipment malfunction. As the reality became undeniable, communications centers throughout the Reich broadcast increasingly frantic warnings that this was no ordinary raid. The Nazi leadership, huddled in their bunkers beneath Berlin, received reports that confirmed their worst fears about the war's trajectory. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, reviewing the intelligence assessments in his office, understood immediately that the massive raid represented more than military strategy. It was a statement of absolute Allied supremacy that would be impossible to conceal from the German people. "This changes everything," he told his aide, as air raid sirens wailed outside. "We can explain away defeats on distant battlefields, but we cannot hide 1,000 bombers over Berlin. The people will see this display of enemy strength and understand that our promises of miracle weapons were lies." As the first bombers reached their initial points and began their bombing runs, the psychological impact on Berlin's population was already devastating. The sheer scale of the attack had shattered any remaining illusions about Germany's ability to continue the war effectively. The sight of such overwhelming aerial power had accomplished what years of propaganda had failed to achieve. It had forced ordinary Germans to confront the reality of their situation. The anti-aircraft guns began firing in sequence, creating a hellish symphony of explosions that shook the city to its foundations. Yet for all their sound and fury, the flak barrage seemed pitiful against the massive formation overhead. The bombers maintained their courses with disciplined precision, their crews protected by the knowledge that no defense could effectively engage such numbers. Frau Hoffmann gathered her children in the basement of their apartment building, trying to project calm while terror gripped her heart. Through the small windows, she could see the sky alive with falling bombs and exploding flak shells. The daylight filtered through smoke and fire into an apocalyptic twilight. "Will the Americans kill us, Mama?" her 7-year-old daughter whispered, clinging to her mother's coat as explosions shook dust from the ceiling. Hoffmann found herself unable to answer, not because she didn't know, but because she realized she no longer cared about politics or victory or defeat. She cared only about surviving the next few hours with her children alive. The war had suddenly become personal in a way that years of distant battles and propaganda speeches had never achieved. The first bombs began falling at exactly 12:15 p.m., striking with precision that demonstrated the bomber crew's extensive training and preparation. Industrial targets, transportation hubs, and government buildings disappeared in clouds of smoke and debris, while the civilian population cowered in shelters and basements throughout the city. Yet perhaps the most significant impact of the 1,000-bomber raid was not the physical destruction it caused, but the psychological devastation it inflicted on German morale. In a single afternoon, the overwhelming display of Allied air power had accomplished what years of battlefield defeats had failed to achieve. It had broken the spirit of resistance that had sustained the German people through their darkest hours. As the bombers turned for home and the all-clear sirens finally sounded, Berlin emerged into an afternoon transformed by more than smoke and rubble. The city's population had witnessed undeniable proof that the war was lost, that continued resistance was futile, and that the 1,000-year Reich would not survive another 1,000 days. The 1,000 bombers over Berlin had delivered more than explosive ordnance. They had delivered a message that would echo through the ruins of Nazi Germany. The age of Allied supremacy had arrived, and it was absolute, undeniable, and final. The first wave of bombs began falling on Berlin at precisely 12:15 p.m., but for Hauptfeldwebel Gustav Brenner of the Berlin Fire Brigade, the true horror began not with the explosions, but with the terrible silence that preceded them. A moment of absolute quiet, when even the flak guns paused, as if the city itself was holding its breath before the devastation began. Standing on the steps of Fire Station 7 in the Charlottenburg district, Brenner watched the bomb bay doors of the lead B-17s swing open like mechanical mouths preparing to devour his city. In his 23 years as a firefighter, he had battled blazes in tenements, factories, and theaters, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to witness: the systematic obliteration of Berlin by an armada that stretched beyond the horizon. "All units prepare for multiple simultaneous incidents," he radioed to his stations throughout the city, his voice steady despite the terror gripping his chest. "This will not be like previous raids. Today we face something beyond our capacity to control." The admission went against every instinct of a man trained to fight fires and save lives, but the evidence of his eyes could not be denied. The sheer number of aircraft overhead guaranteed destruction on a scale that would overwhelm every emergency service in the city. They would do their duty, but they would be fighting a losing battle against an enemy equipped with overwhelming superiority. 2 kilometers away in the Tiergarten district, Frau Else Kruger huddled in the basement of the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, with nearly 200 other civilians, listening to the approaching thunder of engines that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. At 68, she had lived through the Great War and the hyperinflation of the 1920s, but the sound filling the sky above was unlike anything in her experience of human conflict. "Hey, it sounds like the end of the world," she whispered to her neighbor, Frau Müller, who was clutching her infant son to her chest. "How can there be so many planes? How can any nation afford to build such an armada?" The questions reflected the psychological shock that was paralyzing Berlin's civilian population. Years of Nazi propaganda had portrayed America as a decadent nation, lacking the industrial capacity for sustained warfare, yet the evidence overhead suggested productive capabilities that dwarfed anything Germany had ever achieved. The cognitive dissonance was breaking down the psychological foundations that had sustained civilian morale through years of hardship. Above the city, the bomber streams executed their approach with mechanical precision that demonstrated months of intensive training and preparation. Each aircraft maintained its position in the formation with a discipline that spoke to the professionalism of American aircrews and the overwhelming resources that had made such a massive operation possible. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, leading the 381st Bombardment Group from the cockpit of his B-17 Hells Angels, surveyed the German capital spread below him with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal regret. The destruction they were about to unleash was necessary to end the war, but the human cost would be enormous for the civilians trapped below. "Navigator, confirm target identification," he called over the intercom, following procedures that had become second nature through repeated missions over German targets. "Bombardier, prepare for bomb run. We're going to end this war today, one way or another." The response crackled back through the aircraft's communication system. "Target confirmed, Colonel. Industrial district bearing 090 degrees. 2 minutes to release point. Bomb bay doors opening now." The mechanical precision of the American bombing operation stood in stark contrast to the chaos erupting on the ground below. German air defenses, overwhelmed by the scale of the attack, fired frantically but ineffectively at targets too numerous to engage systematically. Individual gun crews found themselves selecting targets almost at random from the endless streams of bombers passing overhead. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, still manning his 88-meter gun atop the Reich Chancellery, had given up trying to track individual aircraft and was firing into the bomber formations in the desperate hope that random chance might bring down at least one enemy plane. The mathematical odds against success were overwhelming, but duty demanded that he continue fighting even when victory was impossible. "Load high explosive," he shouted to his crew, his words barely audible above the thunder of engines and the crash of exploding flak shells. "We'll keep firing until they're gone, or until we're dead. This is Berlin. We don't surrender." The defiant words masked psychological devastation that was affecting German military personnel throughout the city. Professional soldiers trained to assess enemy capabilities could see clearly that the attacking force possessed resources that made effective resistance impossible, yet military discipline demanded that they continue fighting despite the futility of their efforts. The first bomb struck the Tempelhof district at 12:18 p.m., destroying a railroad marshalling yard with precision that demonstrated the effectiveness of American bombing technology and training. The explosions created mushroom clouds of smoke and debris that could be seen from across the city, announcing to Berlin's population that the long-anticipated final reckoning had begun. In the basement of her apartment building, Frau Greta Hoffmann felt the floor shake beneath her feet as explosions marched steadily closer to her neighborhood. Her children pressed against her sides, drawing comfort from maternal warmth while the world outside seemed to disintegrate around them. "Mama, why are there so many planes?" her 10-year-old son asked, his voice small and frightened in the darkness of their improvised shelter. Where did they all come from? Hoffmann found herself unable to answer, not because she didn't understand the military situation, but because admitting the truth would require acknowledging that everything she had believed about Germany's strength and prospects had been an illusion. The 1,000 bombers overhead represented reality, breaking through propaganda, and the truth was too terrible to share with children. "They came from very far away," she finally whispered, pulling her son closer. "But they will go away again, and we will rebuild what they destroy. We are Berliners. We survive everything." The words were meant to comfort her child, but they rang hollow even to her own ears. The scale of destruction unfolding around them suggested damage that would take decades to repair, if Berlin survived the war at all. The 1,000 bombers had brought more than explosives. They had delivered proof that the war was irrevocably lost. At Fire Station 7, Hauptfeldwebel Brenner received the first reports of major blazes erupting throughout his district. Industrial facilities, government buildings, and residential areas were all under simultaneous attack, creating multiple emergencies that would require more resources than his entire department possessed, even under normal circumstances. "Station 3 reports major fires at the Siemens plant," his radio operator called out, listing incidents that were multiplying faster than they could be catalogued. "Station 5 has apartment buildings burning on Kantstrasse. Station 12 needs immediate assistance with fires at the railroad station." Brenner studied his district map with growing despair, marking incident locations that covered virtually every neighborhood under his command. The systematic nature of the attack had created a scenario that fire service planning had never contemplated: simultaneous major emergencies that would require choosing which blazes to fight and which to allow to burn unchecked. "All units implement emergency triage protocols," he ordered, his voice heavy with the weight of decisions that would determine who lived and who died. "Priority to incidents where lives can be saved. Industrial targets are secondary. We save people first, property second." The decision reflected not just tactical necessity, but moral priorities that distinguished German emergency services from their Nazi political leadership. While party officials had sacrificed civilian welfare for military objectives, firefighters and medical personnel maintained focus on preserving human life even when victory was impossible. The bombing continued with relentless precision as wave after wave of American aircraft released their ordnance over carefully selected targets throughout Berlin. Each group had trained for months on scale models of their specific objectives, and the results demonstrated the effectiveness of intensive preparation combined with overwhelming numerical superiority. Captain William Morrison, piloting his B-24 Liberator Lady over the Spandau Industrial District, watched through his bombardier's scope as their bombs struck a synthetic fuel plant with devastating accuracy. The facility disappeared in a series of explosions that sent columns of black smoke thousands of feet into the air. Visible proof that American strategic bombing had achieved tactical precision that made resistance increasingly futile. Direct hits on primary target, his bombardier reported with professional satisfaction. That plant won't be producing fuel for the Wehrmacht anymore. Secondary explosions indicate complete destruction of production facilities. The systematic elimination of German industrial capacity was proceeding with an efficiency that would have been impossible earlier in the war, when smaller formations had struggled against effective air defenses. The overwhelming numerical superiority that America had achieved by 1945 allowed precision targeting that was impossible when bomber crews had to focus primarily on survival rather than accuracy. Below in the city, the psychological impact of witnessing such systematic destruction was devastating civilian morale in ways that years of gradual decline had never achieved. The sight of familiar landmarks disappearing in clouds of smoke and debris forced ordinary Germans to confront the reality that their leaders had led them into a war they could never win. Professor Wilhelm Schmidt, still huddled in the basement of the Adlon Hotel, listened to the explosions moving systematically through the city and recognized the sound of an empire dying. The historian in him appreciated the dramatic nature of the moment, while the human being grieved for the civilization that was being reduced to rubble around him. "This is how it ends," he told the frightened civilians around him, his voice barely audible above the crash of bombs and the wail of air raid sirens. Not with great battles or heroic last stands, but with the methodical destruction of everything we built. We are witnessing the funeral of our world. The observation captured the existential nature of what was occurring above Berlin. The 1,000 bombers represented more than military force. They embodied the transformation of warfare into an industrial process that could methodically dismantle entire societies through the application of overwhelming technological and economic superiority. As the bombing raid continued through the early afternoon, the city's air defenses gradually fell silent as ammunition supplies were exhausted and gun positions were destroyed by direct hits. The systematic elimination of German defensive capabilities had reduced Berlin to a target that could be attacked with virtual impunity, marking the end of effective resistance to Allied air power. Obergefreiter Möller, his ammunition depleted and his gun position damaged by near misses, stood amid the wreckage of his 88mm flak gun and watched the final waves of bombers pass overhead without opposition. The silence was more devastating than the explosions had been because it represented the complete collapse of Berlin's ability to defend itself. "We are finished," he said quietly to his surviving crew members, his words cutting through the sudden quiet that followed the last bomber's departure. "Not just this battle, but everything. No nation can survive what we have just witnessed. The war is over. We simply haven't admitted it yet." The admission represented psychological capitulation that was occurring throughout German society, as the overwhelming evidence of Allied superiority made continued resistance psychologically impossible. The 1,000 bombers had achieved more than physical destruction. They had broken the spirit that had sustained German resistance through years of increasingly desperate warfare. The last bomber disappeared into the western horizon at 2:28 p.m., leaving behind a silence that was more terrifying than the thunder of 1,000 engines had been. Berlin lay beneath a pall of smoke that blocked the afternoon sun, transforming day into an apocalyptic twilight that seemed to announce the end of more than just another air raid. For those who had lived through the bombardment, the quiet that followed marked not relief, but the beginning of a reckoning with devastation beyond anything they had previously imagined possible. Hauptfeldwebel Gustav Brenner emerged from Fire Station 7 into a world transformed by destruction so complete that familiar landmarks had simply ceased to exist. The Charlottenburg district that he had protected for over 2 decades bore no resemblance to the neighborhood he had known. Entire city blocks had been reduced to smoking rubble, while fires too numerous to count sent columns of black smoke into the darkening sky. "Mein Gott," he whispered, surveying devastation that exceeded his worst nightmares. "How do we even begin to fight fires when the entire city is burning?" The question was more than rhetorical. In his professional experience, major fires occurred as isolated incidents that could be contained through systematic application of firefighting resources and techniques. What lay before him now was not a series of separate emergencies, but a single catastrophe that had consumed entire districts simultaneously, creating a scenario for which no training could have prepared him. His radio crackled with reports from surviving fire stations throughout Berlin, each transmission painting a picture of destruction that seemed to grow worse with every update. The systematic nature of the bombing had created fires in every district of the city simultaneously, overwhelming emergency services that had been designed to handle individual incidents rather than citywide catastrophe. Station 12 reports total loss of the government district, his communications officer called out, listing casualties that represented not just buildings, but the infrastructure of an entire civilization. Station 6 has lost contact, presumed destroyed. Station 15 requests immediate assistance, but cannot specify location due to absence of recognizable landmarks. Brenner studied his operations map with growing despair, marking locations where fire stations had fallen silent and emergency services had been eliminated, along with the communities they served. The 1,000-bomber raid had not merely damaged Berlin, it had systematically dismantled the city's capacity to respond to its own destruction. 3 kilometers away in the basement of the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, Frau Else Kruger led 200 survivors in climbing from their shelter into a world that no longer made sense. The familiar street corner where she had lived for 30 years had been transformed into a moonscape of craters and rubble, where no building stood higher than a man's head. "This cannot be real," she murmured, staring at devastation so complete that her mind refused to process it. This must be a nightmare. Cities do not disappear in a single afternoon. Yet the evidence of her senses could not be denied. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, which had survived the Great War and served as a symbol of Berlin's endurance, had been reduced to a skeleton of twisted steel and shattered stone. The destruction seemed designed not merely to eliminate military targets, but to break the psychological foundation that had sustained Berlin's population through years of hardship. Beside her, Frau Müller clutched her infant son while staring at the ruins of her apartment building, trying to comprehend that everything she owned, photographs, letters, mementos of a lifetime, had been reduced to ash and debris in the space of a few hours. The scale of loss was beyond her ability to process emotionally. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice hollow with shock. "Where do we go when our entire world has been destroyed?" The questions reflected the existential crisis facing Berlin's survivors. The bombing had eliminated not just buildings, but the social and economic infrastructure that had sustained urban life. Shops, schools, hospitals, government offices, all had been targeted with precision that left survivors not just homeless, but cut off from the systems that had organized their existence. In his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler received reports of the devastating raid with a mixture of rage and disbelief that reflected his complete disconnection from military reality. The Führer, who had promised German invincibility, was confronting undeniable evidence that his enemies possessed capabilities he had never imagined possible. "How is this possible?" he screamed at his military advisors, his voice echoing through the concrete chambers that had become his tomb. "Where are our fighters? Where are our miracle weapons? How can 1,000 enemy planes attack Berlin without effective opposition?" The questions revealed the psychological breakdown of Nazi leadership when confronted with the military realities their propaganda had denied for years. The systematic deception that had sustained their power was colliding with evidence so overwhelming that even their capacity for self-delusion could not survive the impact. Generaloberst Hans Jeschonek, one of the few remaining Luftwaffe commanders, attempted to explain the impossible mathematics of aerial warfare to leaders who had consistently ignored professional military advice in favor of ideological fantasy. His assessment was clinically accurate, but psychologically devastating. "Mein Führer, the enemy possesses numerical superiority of approximately 50-1 in operational aircraft," he reported, his voice steady despite the hopelessness of the situation. "Our remaining fighters can engage perhaps 2% of an attacking formation this size. We cannot defend against such overwhelming force with the resources currently available." The admission represented military reality, penetrating political fantasy in ways that made continued resistance psychologically impossible for rational observers. Yet, Hitler's response demonstrated the complete disconnect between Nazi leadership and the situation facing German society. "Then we will fight with everything we have," he declared, pounding his fist on the bunker table. "Every man, woman, and child will resist the enemy invaders. We will turn every building into a fortress and every street into a battlefield. The grandiose rhetoric could not conceal the fact that Berlin's capacity for organized resistance had been systematically eliminated by the 1,000-bomber raid. The destruction of communication systems, transportation networks, and administrative centers had reduced the capital of the Reich to a collection of isolated survivors struggling for individual survival. Above ground, those survivors were beginning to comprehend the full extent of what they had lost. 12-year-old Klaus Weber climbed from his apartment building's basement to discover that the structure above had simply ceased to exist, leaving only a pile of rubble that bore no resemblance to the home where he had lived his entire life. His diary entry that evening, written by candlelight in a temporary shelter, captured the psychological impact with devastating clarity. Today I learned that everything can disappear in a single afternoon. The American bombers did not just destroy buildings, they destroyed the idea that anything is permanent. If 1,000 planes can appear in the sky and erase a city, then nothing we believe about the world can be trusted. The philosophical implications of witnessing such overwhelming destruction were forcing ordinary Germans to question fundamental assumptions about their government, their military, and their future. The cognitive foundations that had sustained support for continued warfare were crumbling under the weight of empirical evidence that resistance was futile. Throughout Berlin, emergency services struggled to establish even basic coordination in the face of destruction that had eliminated most communication systems and transportation networks. Firefighting efforts focused on isolated blazes that could be contained, while major conflagrations were allowed to burn unchecked due to lack of resources and access routes. Hauptfeldwebel Brenner led his surviving crews through streets that no longer existed on any map, navigating by the glow of fires and the sound of voices calling for help from beneath collapsed buildings. The systematic nature of the destruction had created a scenario where individual acts of heroism could save lives but could not address the broader catastrophe that had overwhelmed the city. "We save who we can," he told his exhausted firefighters as they worked to free survivors from a collapsed apartment building. "We cannot save Berlin. That was decided today when the sky filled with bombers. But we can save individual people, and that must be enough." The philosophy reflected a turning away from grand political objectives toward basic human compassion that characterized the response of many ordinary Germans to the devastating raid. Faced with overwhelming evidence that the war was lost, civilians and civil servants focused on preserving life rather than pursuing military victory. The evening hours brought a steady stream of survivors, emerging from basements and shelters throughout Berlin, each confronting personal variations of the same devastating reality. The city they had known was gone, replaced by a landscape of ruins that bore little resemblance to the capital of the Reich. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Frau Greta Hoffmann led her children through streets clogged with debris and bodies, searching for any trace of the neighborhood grocery store where they had shopped for years. Finding only a crater filled with twisted metal and broken glass, she realized that the social networks and economic systems that had sustained daily life had been eliminated as systematically as military targets. "Where will we buy food?" her daughter asked, the practical question revealing the broader implications of the systematic destruction. "Where will we live? Where will we go to school?" Hoffmann found herself unable to answer because the infrastructure that had supported all those activities no longer existed. The 1,000-bomber raid had achieved more than tactical objectives. It had dismantled the foundations of urban civilization, leaving survivors to confront the necessity of rebuilding not just buildings, but entire ways of life. As night fell over the burning city, the psychological impact of the day's events began to penetrate even the most dedicated Nazi supporters. The evidence of Allied superiority had been too overwhelming to dismiss through propaganda or rationalization. Berlin's population was beginning to understand that continued resistance would only prolong suffering without changing the war's inevitable outcome. In temporary shelters throughout the city, conversations that had been unthinkable just hours earlier began to occur as ordinary Germans acknowledged what their eyes had witnessed. The discussion reflected the collapse of psychological barriers that had prevented realistic assessment of Germany's military situation. "No nation can survive what we saw today," Professor Schmidt told fellow refugees huddled in the ruins of a bombed-out school. The Americans demonstrated capabilities that make our defeat inevitable. The only question now is how much more destruction we will endure before our leaders accept reality. The assessment represented a psychological transformation that was occurring throughout German society as the overwhelming evidence of Allied superiority made continued self-deception impossible. The 1,000 bombers had delivered more than explosives. They had forced a reckoning with reality that would accelerate Germany's psychological surrender. The silence that had followed the thunder of 1,000 engines was not the quiet of peace, but the hush that precedes final collapse. Berlin had survived the physical destruction of the massive raid, but the psychological foundations that had sustained resistance had been shattered beyond repair. The war would continue for several more weeks, but the spiritual capitulation of the German people had already begun on the afternoon when the sky turned black with Allied bombers. The fires burning throughout Berlin that night illuminated more than destroyed buildings. They cast light on the psychological rubble of a people who had finally glimpsed the true scope of their defeat. As darkness fell over the devastated capital, survivors of the 1,000-bomber raid faced a reckoning not just with physical destruction, but with the collapse of every illusion that had sustained them through 6 years of total war. Dr. Heinrich Weber, chief medical officer at Berlin's Charité Hospital, stood in what remained of his facility's emergency ward and confronted casualties that represented more than the afternoon's bombing. The wounded streaming through his doors bore injuries to body and spirit that spoke to the systematic dismantling of an entire society's capacity for self-deception. "We are treating more than blast victims and burn injuries," he confided to his exhausted staff as they worked through the night. "We are witnessing the psychological collapse of an entire population. These people have seen proof that everything they believed about German strength was a lie, and that knowledge may be more devastating than their physical wounds." The observation reflected insights that medical professionals were documenting throughout the city. The trauma of witnessing such overwhelming enemy superiority had created mental health casualties that no amount of propaganda could heal. The cognitive dissonance between Nazi promises and observed reality had broken psychological defenses that had sustained civilian morale through years of hardship. Among the patients filling the hospital's improvised treatment areas was Obergefreiter Hans Müller, the flak gunner who had watched helplessly as his air defenses were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. His physical injuries were minor, but the psychological wounds ran much deeper. "Doctor, I have been a soldier for 5 years," he told Dr. Weber during his examination, his voice hollow with defeated recognition. "I believed in our cause, in our strength, in our inevitable victory. But today I saw 1,000 enemy bombers darken the sky over Berlin, and I knew that everything was lost. How do I live with that knowledge?" The question represented existential crisis that was affecting German military personnel throughout Berlin. Professional soldiers trained to assess enemy capabilities could no longer deny the mathematical reality that made effective resistance impossible, yet their entire identity had been built around faith in ultimate German victory. Dr. Weber's response reflected the wisdom of a medical professional who had seen human resilience triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. "You live by accepting truth rather than comfortable lies, by finding meaning in survival rather than victory, by building something better from the ruins of what was destroyed." The philosophical framework that Weber offered was being embraced by increasing numbers of Germans who recognized that psychological healing required abandoning the illusions that had led to catastrophic defeat. The 1,000-bomber raid had provided undeniable evidence that reality was more powerful than ideology, and survival required adaptation to facts rather than faith in fantasy. Throughout Berlin that night, similar conversations were occurring as ordinary Germans began to discuss openly what had been unthinkable just hours earlier: the reality that the war was lost and continued resistance was futile. The psychological barriers that had prevented honest assessment of Germany's situation had been shattered by evidence too overwhelming to deny or rationalize. In the basement shelter beneath the ruined department store, where she now found refuge, Frau Greta Hoffmann engaged in discussions with fellow survivors that would have resulted in arrests for defeatism before the 1,000-bomber raid. The shared trauma of witnessing such devastating enemy superiority had created bonds of common understanding that transcended political indoctrination. "We must face the truth," she told the group of women and children huddled around a makeshift fire. No nation can survive what we witnessed today. The Americans showed us capabilities that make our defeat inevitable. Our only choice now is whether we surrender with dignity or let them destroy what remains of our city and our people. The words represented a fundamental shift in civilian attitude that was occurring throughout German society. The overwhelming display of Allied power had broken through years of propaganda conditioning to force honest assessment of military realities that Nazi leadership had hidden from their people. The psychological foundation of continued resistance had collapsed under the weight of empirical evidence. Her observations were echoed by Professor Wilhelm Schmidt, whose historical perspective provided context for understanding the magnitude of what they had witnessed. In all of recorded history, no military force has ever demonstrated such complete aerial supremacy over an enemy capital. We have witnessed the dawn of a new age of warfare, and Germany belongs to the past that is being swept away. The scholarly assessment captured the epical nature of what had occurred over Berlin. The 1,000-bomber raid represented more than tactical success. It marked the emergence of American military capabilities that would define the post-war world order. Germany's defeat was no longer a matter of military strategy, but historical inevitability. In his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler raged against reports that civilian morale had collapsed throughout Berlin, refusing to acknowledge that his promises of miracle weapons and inevitable victory had been exposed as delusions by the afternoon's devastating demonstration of enemy strength. His continued demands for resistance reflected complete disconnection from the psychological reality affecting his people. "The German people will fight to the last man," he declared to subordinates who knew the war was lost but lacked the courage to challenge his delusional orders. "Every building will become a fortress. Every street will run red with enemy blood." The grandiose rhetoric could not conceal the fact that Berlin's population was already beginning to plan for survival in a post-Nazi Germany. The 1,000-bomber raid had accomplished what years of military defeats had failed to achieve. It had forced ordinary Germans to abandon faith in their leadership and begin preparing for life after the Reich's inevitable collapse. The psychological transformation was perhaps most evident among German military personnel who possessed the professional knowledge necessary to understand the full implications of what they had witnessed. Throughout Berlin's military installations, officers were conducting private discussions about the mathematical impossibility of continued effective resistance. Oberst Friedrich Weber, the flak commander, who had watched his defenses overwhelmed by sheer numbers, found himself questioning not just military strategy, but the entire political system that had led Germany into unwinnable conflict. His conversation with subordinate officers reflected broader recognition that Nazi ideology had systematically ignored military realities. "We were told that American industry was too weak for sustained warfare," he confided to his remaining staff officers in the ruins of his command post. "Today we saw evidence that they can deploy 1,000 bombers against a single target while maintaining operations on multiple fronts worldwide. Our intelligence was not merely wrong, it was catastrophically delusional." The admission represented intellectual honesty that had been impossible under Nazi political control, but was now being forced by evidence too overwhelming to deny. Military professionals who had suppressed doubts about German capabilities were finally free to acknowledge realities that had been hidden by ideological conditioning. The systematic nature of the destruction caused by the 1,000-bomber raid had also eliminated much of the infrastructure necessary for continued organized resistance. Communication systems, transportation networks, and administrative centers had been targeted with precision that made coordinated defense increasingly difficult. Hauptfeldwebel Gustav Brenner, still leading rescue efforts throughout the burning city, recognized that Berlin's capacity for military function had been systematically dismantled by the afternoon's attack. His assessment was grimly professional and utterly realistic. "We are no longer defending a military position," he reported to surviving emergency services personnel. "We are managing humanitarian catastrophe in a city that has lost the infrastructure necessary for organized defense. Our duty now is to preserve civilian lives, not military objectives." The philosophy reflected broader acceptance among German civil servants and emergency personnel that their primary obligation had shifted from supporting the war effort to protecting civilian population from further unnecessary destruction. The 1,000-bomber raid had made continued military resistance not just futile, but actively harmful to German society. As April progressed toward May 1945, the psychological impact of the massive Berlin raid accelerated the collapse of German resistance throughout the Reich. Word of the devastating attack spread through military and civilian networks, carrying with it undeniable evidence that further fighting would only prolong suffering without affecting the war's outcome. The correspondence that Berlin survivors maintained with family and friends in other German cities provided first-hand testimony about Allied capabilities that countered Nazi propaganda about eventual German victory. These personal communications were more persuasive than any official pronouncements because they came from trusted sources who had witnessed the overwhelming display of enemy strength. Frau Hoffmann's letter to her sister in Munich captured the psychological transformation occurring throughout German society. Dear Liesel, you cannot imagine what we witnessed here. The entire sky filled with American bombers, more planes than I thought existed in the world. They destroyed half the city in a single afternoon, and we could do nothing to stop them. The war is over, even if our leaders refuse to admit it. Save yourself and your family by accepting this truth. Such communications were multiplying throughout Germany as survivors of the Berlin raid shared their experiences with people who had not yet confronted the full scope of Allied superiority. The psychological impact was spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, gradually undermining support for continued resistance throughout German society. The international implications of the 1,000-bomber raid were also becoming apparent as neutral observers reported the devastating display of American air power to governments worldwide. The demonstration of such overwhelming military capability sent clear messages about post-war power relationships that would influence diplomatic calculations for years to come. Swiss intelligence reports on the Berlin raid emphasized not just the tactical success, but the strategic implications of the attack. The Americans have demonstrated production and logistical capabilities that surpass anything achieved by any nation in human history. The 1,000-bomber formation represents the emergence of military power that will dominate the post-war international system. The assessment proved prophetic for understanding how the massive raid had achieved objectives beyond immediate military goals. The demonstration of overwhelming American strength had established psychological foundations for post-war international order based on recognition of unquestioned Allied supremacy. The final weeks of the European war were shaped significantly by the psychological impact of the 1,000-bomber raid on Berlin. German military and civilian leaders who had witnessed or received reports about the overwhelming display of Allied power began making private preparations for surrender and post-war survival rather than continued resistance. The formal German surrender on May 8, 1945, represented not just military defeat, but psychological capitulation that had begun on March 18th when 1,000 bombers darkened the sky over Berlin. The massive raid had achieved more than destruction of targets. It had shattered the will to continue fighting among people who had finally seen undeniable proof of their hopeless situation. Dr. Weber's final diary entry before Berlin's fall captured the transformation that had occurred since the 1,000-bomber raid. Today we surrender not just our armies but our illusions. The bombers that filled our sky 2 months ago brought more than explosives. They brought truth. We learned that reality is more powerful than propaganda, that numbers matter more than ideology, and that survival requires accepting facts rather than believing fantasies. The observation reflected broader recognition among German intellectuals and professionals that recovery from total war would require abandoning the ideological thinking that had led to catastrophic defeat. The psychological impact of witnessing overwhelming Allied superiority had forced honest assessment of German capabilities and limitations that would influence post-war reconstruction efforts. The 1,000-bomber raid over Berlin had marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, not through physical destruction alone, but through psychological devastation that made continued resistance impossible. The sight of such overwhelming enemy strength had broken the spirit of a people who had sustained themselves through years of hardship with faith in ultimate victory, forcing them to confront the reality that their leaders had led them into unwinnable war. The legacy of that March afternoon would extend far beyond the immediate military consequences to influence German attitudes toward militarism, nationalism, and international cooperation for generations to come. The 1,000 bombers had delivered more than ordnance. They had brought the reckoning that ended an empire and began the difficult process of building something better from its ruins. The story of 1,000 Allied bombers appearing over Berlin in 1945 represents one of World War II's most psychologically devastating moments for the German people. This massive display of Allied air power didn't just destroy buildings, it shattered the illusions that had sustained German resistance and forced a reckoning with the mathematical reality of their defeat. From the terror of civilians watching the sky turn black with aircraft to the despair of military personnel who realized their defenses were utterly inadequate, the raid marked the moment when Germany's psychological surrender began. The overwhelming evidence of Allied industrial and military superiority made continued resistance not just futile but impossible to justify to people who had witnessed such devastating proof of enemy capabilities. What struck you most about how ordinary Germans reacted to seeing such overwhelming force displayed above their capital? Were you surprised by how quickly the psychological impact spread beyond just the physical destruction? Share your thoughts in the comments about how displays of overwhelming power can break the will to fight even when people still have weapons. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button for more incredible stories of how single moments in warfare can determine the fate of entire nations.